Hey everyone, welcome back. Carl Jung's dark truth about women. Men must know. What if everything you thought you knew about women was filtered through centuries of misunderstanding? What if one of history's greatest psychologists uncovered truths about the feminine psyche that could revolutionize how we understand relationships, attraction, and human nature itself? Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, spent decades studying the human mind. But buried in his extensive research lies insights about feminine psychology that few people truly understand. Insights that could change your perspective on relationships forever. We're going deep into Jung's most profound discoveries about the feminine psyche. This isn't about generalizations or stereotypes. This is about understanding the psychological patterns that Jung observed through decades of clinical work with thousands of patients. But before we dive in, let me ask you this. Have you ever felt like you were speaking a completely different language when trying to connect with women? Like there were unspoken rules and hidden dynamics you just couldn't grasp? Jung believed he found the answer, and it's far more complex and fascinating than you might imagine. If you're ready to explore the depths of human psychology and gain insights that could transform your understanding of relationships, hit that subscribe button and let's begin this journey into the mind of Carl Jung. Chapter 1. Who was Carl Jung? Before we explore Jung's insights about feminine psychology, we need to understand the man behind the theories. Carl Gustav Jung wasn't just any psychologist. He was a revolutionary thinker who dared to explore the deepest mysteries of the human psyche. Born in Switzerland in 1875, Jung initially worked alongside Sigmund Freud. But their partnership ended when Jung began developing ideas that went far beyond Freud's focus on sexuality. Where Freud saw everything through the lens of repressed desires, Jung saw something much more complex, a rich inner world filled with symbols, archetypes, and collective unconscious patterns. Here's what made Jung different. He didn't just theorize from his office. He studied mythology, religion, alchemy, and cultures from around the world. He analyzed thousands of dreams, worked with patients from all walks of life, and even explored his own psyche through what he called active imagination. Jung's approach to understanding women came from direct clinical observation. He worked with hundreds of female patients, analyzed their dreams, studied their psychological patterns, and noticed recurring themes that transcended individual personalities. This wasn't armchair philosophy. This was empirical psychology, based on real human experiences. But here's where it gets interesting. Jung discovered that many of the assumptions society had about women were not only wrong, but were actually projections of men's own unconscious fears and desires. He called this phenomenon anima projection, and it's one of the most misunderstood concepts in psychology. Jung identified several key aspects of feminine psychology that he believed most people, including women themselves, didn't fully understand. These insights came from observing patterns in dreams, analyzing mythological stories across cultures, and working with patients who were struggling in relationships. The question is, are you ready to challenge everything you think you know about feminine psychology? Because Jung's discoveries might surprise you. Chapter 2. The Anima, Your Inner Feminine. Jung's most groundbreaking discovery about understanding women wasn't actually about women at all, it was about men. He discovered that every man carries within his unconscious mind a feminine aspect he called the anima. Think about this for a moment. According to Jung, you don't just interact with women, you interact with women through the lens of your own inner feminine. This means that your understanding of women is filtered through your own unconscious feminine qualities. And here's the shocking part. Most men are completely unaware this is happening. Let me explain how this works. The anima isn't just some abstract concept, it's an active, psychological force that influences every interaction you have with women. Jung observed that men often fall in love not with the actual woman in front of them, but with their own anima projected onto that woman. This is why relationships can feel so intense at the beginning, but then seem to fall apart. When reality sets in, you're not just getting to know her. You're discovering that she's different from your unconscious feminine ideal. Jung worked with a patient, let's call him Marcus, who kept falling for the same type of woman over and over again. Mysterious, artistic, slightly melancholic women who seemed to carry some kind of secret wisdom. But every relationship ended the same way, with Marcus feeling disappointed and the woman feeling misunderstood. Through analysis, Jung helped Marcus realize that he was projecting his own undeveloped intuitive and creative qualities onto these women. He was seeking in them what he needed to develop in himself. Once Marcus began integrating his own anima, his own capacity for intuition, creativity, and emotional depth, his relationships completely transformed. Here's Jung's profound insight. The way you see women reveals more about your own unconscious than it does about women themselves. If you consistently see women as mysterious and incomprehensible, Jung would say you're projecting your own undeveloped intuitive abilities. If you see them as overly emotional, you might be projecting your own fear of emotional depth. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Jung discovered that women have their own version of this, something he called the animus, their inner masculine. And understanding this dynamic between anima and animus is crucial for healthy relationships. I want you to think about your last relationship for a moment. Can you identify moments where you might have been seeing your partner through the lens of your own projections rather than seeing her as she actually was? Drop a comment below if this resonates with you, because what we're about to explore next will blow your mind. The anima has different developmental stages, and most men never progress beyond the first two levels. This keeps them trapped in immature relationship patterns. Let me show you these stages and how they might be affecting your relationships right now. Chapter 3. The 4 Stages of Anima Development. Jung discovered that the anima develops through 4 distinct stages, and where you are in this development determines not just how you see women, but what kind of relationships you attract and how successful they'll be. Stage 1. Eve, the biological woman. The first stage Jung called Eve, representing woman as the biological, instinctual feminine. Men at this stage see women primarily through the lens of physical attraction and basic biological functions. It's not necessarily sexual. It's more primitive than that. A man operating from stage 1 anima sees women as fundamentally different creatures, almost like another species. He might idealize them as pure and innocent, or demonize them as tempting and dangerous, but he doesn't see them as complex individuals with their own inner lives. You see this in men who put women on pedestals, thinking they're too pure for this world, or conversely, men who see women as fundamentally manipulative or deceptive. Both perspectives come from the same place, an undeveloped anima that can only perceive women in archetypal terms. Stage 2. Helen, the romantic ideal. Stage 2 is what Jung called Helen, after Helen of Troy. This is where women become objects of romantic idealization. The man at this stage is capable of deep romantic feeling, but it's still largely projection-based. This is the stage of courtly love, of putting your beloved on a pedestal, of believing that this one special woman will complete you and solve all your problems. Sound familiar? Most modern dating advice actually keeps men trapped at this stage. Here's what Jung observed. Men at stage 2 can be incredibly passionate and romantic, but they're in love with their own projection, not with the actual woman. When reality inevitably conflicts with the projection, these relationships often become tumultuous or end badly. Stage 3. Mary, the spiritual guide. Stage 3 is Mary, representing woman as spiritual guide and wisdom keeper. Men at this stage begin to see women as having access to deeper wisdom, intuition, and spiritual insight. This is more mature than the first 2 stages, but it still involves projection. The stage 3 man might be drawn to wise maternal women, or women who seem to have spiritual or psychological insights he lacks. While this is more evolved than pure romantic idealization, it's still about what the woman can give him rather than who she actually is. Stage 4. Sophia, wisdom integrated. The final stage is Sophia, wisdom itself. At this stage, a man has integrated his own anima to the point where he no longer needs to project. his unconscious feminine qualities onto women. He can see women as complete individuals with their own complex inner lives. Here's the revolutionary part. Jung believed that only men who reach stage 4 anima development are capable of truly mature relationships. Why? Because they're no longer trying to get something from women. They're able to relate to them as equals. Most men never reach stage 4. They get stuck cycling between the first 3 stages, which explains why so many relationships follow predictable patterns of idealization, disappointment, and conflict. So how do you develop your anima? Jung's answer might surprise you. It's not about studying women. It's about developing your own capacity for intuition, emotional depth, creativity, and what he called feeling function. Take a moment right now to honestly assess which stage resonates most with your current approach to relationships. Are you seeing women as they actually are, or through the lens of your own unconscious projections? The answer to this question determines everything about your relationship success. But understanding the anima is only half the story. Jung discovered something equally important about feminine psychology itself, patterns that exist independently of male projection. And this is where his insights become truly revolutionary. Chapter 4. The Animus, Women's Inner Masculine. Just as men have an inner feminine they often project onto women, Jung discovered that women have an inner masculine, the animus. And understanding how the animus operates is crucial for any man who wants to truly understand feminine psychology. But here's where most people get Jung wrong. The animus isn't about women being masculine or feminine in the traditional sense. It's about psychological functions that exist in everyone but are typically less developed in women, just as the anima represents functions less developed in men. Jung noticed that women's psychological conflicts often centered around their relationship with their own inner masculine. Unlike men who typically project their anima onto one woman at a time, women often have multiple animus figures, different masculine archetypes that represent different aspects of their undeveloped masculine potential. The 4 stages of animus development. Stage 1, the physical man. In the first stage, the animus appears as raw physical power, the strong, silent type, the athlete, the warrior. Women at this stage might be attracted to men who embody pure physical presence but lack psychological complexity. Stage 2, the man of action. The second stage is the man of initiative and planning, the entrepreneur, the adventurer, the goal-oriented achiever. Women at this stage are often drawn to ambitious, driven men who can make things happen in the world. Stage 3, the word, the professor or clergyman. The third stage represents the man of words and ideas, the intellectual, the teacher, the spiritual leader. This is where women develop their own capacity for abstract thinking and meaning-making. Stage 4, the wise man, spiritual meaning. The final stage is the wise man who embodies spiritual insight and deeper meaning. Women who reach this stage have integrated their own capacity for wisdom and no longer need to seek it from external masculine figures. Here's what this means for your relationships. When you understand which stage of animus development a woman is in, you understand what she's unconsciously seeking in men and what kind of conflicts she's likely to experience. Jung worked with a woman who kept attracting unavailable men, married men, men who lived far away, men who were emotionally distant. Through analysis, they discovered she had an undeveloped stage 2 animus. She was projecting her own need for independence and initiative onto these unavailable men rather than developing these qualities in herself. Once she began taking initiative in her own life, starting her own business, pursuing her own goals, she stopped being attracted to unavailable men and began forming healthier relationships. But Jung also observed something darker about the animus. When it's not integrated properly, it can manifest as what he called animus possession, where a woman becomes identified with harsh, critical, or overly rational thinking that cuts her off from her own feminine nature. You've probably encountered this. Women who seem to argue just for the sake of arguing, who become rigidly intellectual, or who seem to have lost touch with their intuitive and feeling nature. Jung would say these women are possessed by an undeveloped animus. Here's Jung's most revolutionary insight about the animus. Women's relationship conflicts aren't usually about the men in their lives. They're about their relationship with their own inner masculine. When a woman is constantly critical of men, constantly disappointed by them, or constantly trying to change them, she's often projecting her own undeveloped masculine qualities. But understanding anima and animus projection is just the beginning. Jung discovered specific patterns in feminine psychology that go much deeper than individual projection. He identified what he called the feminine principle, a way of being and perceiving that operates according to completely different rules than masculine psychology. And this is where his insights become truly transformative for relationships. Chapter 5, The Feminine Principle, a Different Way of Being. This is where Jung's insights become truly profound, and where most people, including many psychologists, completely misunderstand his work. Jung didn't see masculine and feminine as social roles or behavioral traits. He saw them as fundamental psychological principles, different ways of experiencing and interacting with reality. Jung identified what he called the feminine principle, a mode of consciousness that operates according to its own logic, its own values, and its own way of understanding the world. And here's the crucial point. This principle exists in both men and women, but it's typically more developed in women. The characteristics of the feminine principle: relatedness over achievement, where masculine consciousness tends to focus on goals, achievement, and individual accomplishment. Feminine consciousness prioritizes relationships, connections, and the web of interactions between people. This doesn't mean women are less ambitious. It means they typically evaluate their ambitions through the lens of how it affects their relationships. Jung observed that women often struggle when forced to choose between personal achievement and relational harmony in ways that men typically don't. Process over product. Masculine consciousness tends to be goal-oriented, focused on outcomes, results, and finishing tasks. Feminine consciousness is more process-oriented, focused on the quality of experience, the journey itself, and how things unfold. This is why women often seem to overthink situations that men see as straightforward. It's not overthinking. It's a different kind of thinking that considers the process, the context, and the relational implications in ways that linear, goal-oriented thinking might miss. Cyclical rather than linear. Jung observed that feminine consciousness operates in cycles rather than straight lines. Where masculine energy tends to push forward consistently toward goals, feminine energy moves in rhythms, periods of activity and rest, expansion and contraction, doing and being. This is connected to biological cycles, but it goes deeper than that. It's a fundamental way of organizing experience and energy that honors natural rhythms rather than forcing consistent linear progress. Intuitive knowing. Perhaps most importantly, Jung identified what he called feminine ways of knowing, forms of intelligence that don't rely on logical analysis but on intuitive perception, pattern recognition, and what he called feeling function. When Jung talked about feeling function, he wasn't talking about emotions. He was talking about a form of intelligence that evaluates based on values, meaning and significance rather than logical analysis. This is a sophisticated form of cognition that most rational-minded people don't even recognize as intelligence. Jung noticed that women often know things about people and situations that they can't rationally explain, and they're usually right. But in a culture that only values rational, provable knowledge, this intuitive intelligence is often dismissed or devalued. The shadow side of the feminine principle. But Jung also observed that when the feminine principle is undeveloped or distorted, it can manifest in destructive ways. Manipulation through emotional means, rather than direct communication. Excessive focus on relationships to the exclusion of individual development. Mood-dependent decision-making that lacks consistent values. Passive-aggressive behavior when direct assertion feels too masculine. Here's what this means for your relationships. If you're trying to understand women through masculine psychological principles: logic, consistency, linear thinking, goal orientation. You're going to be constantly confused and frustrated. Women operating from the feminine. Principle aren't being illogical. They're using a different kind of logic. They're not being inconsistent. They're responding to different values and priorities than you might be tracking. Jung suggested that healthy relationships require both partners to understand and respect both principles. Men need to develop their capacity for relational thinking, process awareness, and intuitive knowing. Women need to develop their capacity for goal-oriented action, direct communication, and individual assertion. But perhaps Jung's most controversial insight was about what he saw as women's unique psychological vulnerabilities, patterns that could lead to what he called the negative feminine. This isn't about judging women. It's about understanding psychological dynamics that can destroy relationships when they're not consciously addressed. Chapter 6. The Shadow Feminine. Jung's controversial insights. Now we come to Jung's most controversial and misunderstood insights about feminine psychology. These are observations that Jung made based on clinical work with hundreds of patients, but they're insights that many people today find difficult to accept. I want to be clear. These aren't judgments about women. They're observations about psychological patterns that can emerge when certain aspects of the psyche remain unconscious. Jung was very clear that these patterns exist in both men and women, but they manifest differently depending on whether they're filtered through masculine or feminine psychological organization. What he called the shadow feminine represents the destructive potential of feminine energy when it's not consciously integrated, the destructive mother archetype. One of Jung's most significant observations was about what he called the destructive mother. Not literal mothers, but a psychological pattern where feminine energy becomes consuming, possessive, and ultimately destructive to growth and independence. Jung observed this pattern in women who unconsciously sabotage their partners or children's independence, not out of conscious malice, but from an unconscious need to maintain connection and control. This might manifest as emotional manipulation disguised as care and concern, creating dependency rather than encouraging growth, using guilt and emotional pressure to maintain relationships, sabotaging partners' outside interests or friendships. Jung worked with a man whose wife seemed supportive of his career, ambitions, but somehow always had crises or needs that prevented him from pursuing opportunities. Through analysis, they discovered that she had an unconscious fear of his success because it might threaten their relationship. Her caring behavior was actually a form of psychological control. The Medusa complex. Jung identified another shadow pattern. He associated with the mythological figure of Medusa, women who unconsciously use emotional intensity or psychological insights as weapons, turning their strengths into tools of destruction. This might manifest as using emotional intelligence to manipulate rather than connect, weaponizing vulnerability to control others, using psychological insights to attack rather than understand, creating chaos or drama to maintain a sense of power or control. Jung was careful to point out that these patterns usually develop as defense mechanisms against powerlessness or trauma. Women who exhibit these patterns aren't inherently malicious. They're often unconsciously protecting themselves in the only ways they know how. The negative anima in women. Perhaps most controversially, Jung observed that some women become identified with what he called the negative anima, a pattern where they unconsciously act out men's worst projections about women. This might include becoming overly seductive or manipulative, playing into stereotypes about feminine unpredictability or irrationality, using sexuality or emotional volatility as primary sources of power, becoming what Jung called anima women, living only to reflect men's projections rather than developing their own authentic identity. Jung believed this happened when women didn't develop their own strong sense of individual identity their positive animus, and instead became identified with men's unconscious feminine projections. They become, in essence, living embodiments of masculine fantasies or fears about women, the shadow of feminine collective. Jung also observed what he called negative feminine collective, patterns where women become caught up in group dynamics that reinforce unconscious behaviors, gossip and social manipulation disguised as connection, collective undermining of individual women who try to break free from group norms, using emotional contagion to spread negativity or create drama, resistance to direct communication or conflict resolution. You can see these patterns in social media dynamics, workplace politics, and social groups where indirect aggression and emotional manipulation become normalized ways of operating. Jung's solution to these shadow patterns wasn't to suppress the feminine or judge these behaviors. Instead, he believed that consciousness was the answer. When women and men become aware of these unconscious patterns, they can choose more conscious ways of expressing feminine energy. One, for men, understanding these shadow patterns isn't about judging or avoiding women. It's about, 2, not enabling these patterns through your own unconscious behavior. 3, recognizing when you might be triggering these responses through your own projections. 4, learning to respond to shadow feminine behavior in ways that encourage consciousness rather than unconsciousness. Jung believed that both men and women have the capacity for tremendous psychological growth, but only when they're willing to face their own shadow patterns honestly. The question is, are you ready to apply these insights to transform your own relationships and psychological development? Chapter 7. Practical Applications. Transforming Your Relationships. So how do you actually apply Jung's insights to transform your relationships and your own psychological development? After 4 decades of clinical work, Jung developed specific practices and approaches that can help both men and women move toward more conscious, mature relating. For men, developing your anima. Practice emotional intelligence. Start paying attention to the emotional undertones in conversations. Jung believed men often miss entire layers of communication because they're not attuned to emotional subtleties. Practice asking yourself, what is she feeling right now? And how is that affecting what she's saying? Develop your intuitive capacity. Start trusting your first impressions and gut feelings about people and situations. Jung observed that men often override their intuitive insights in favor of logical analysis, but mature masculine energy integrates both. Engage with your own creativity, whether it's art, music, writing, or any form of creative expression. Engaging with creativity helps develop the anima. Jung himself painted, wrote, and engaged in what he called active imagination as ways of connecting with his unconscious feminine. For understanding women better, stop trying to figure women out. Jung's biggest insight was that trying to understand women through masculine logic is like trying to understand music through mathematics. Instead, learn to appreciate the different kind of intelligence and way of being that feminine consciousness represents. Recognize your projections. Before you judge or criticize a woman's behavior, ask yourself, what aspect of my own unconscious might I be projecting here? Often what frustrates us most in others is what we haven't developed in ourselves. Honor different values. Accept that feminine consciousness often prioritizes relationships, process and emotional truth over efficiency, logic and goal achievement. Neither approach is better. They're different, and both are necessary. The ultimate goal, conscious relationship. Jung believed that truly mature relationships happen when both people have developed both their masculine and feminine sides enough that they're not trying to get their partner to carry their undeveloped psychological functions. This means you're attracted to who someone actually is, not your projection of what they represent. You can appreciate different ways of thinking and being without trying to change them. You take responsibility for your own psychological development rather than expecting your partner to complete you. You can engage in conflict consciously, seeing it as an opportunity for growth rather than a threat to the relationship. Jung's insights about masculine and feminine psychology aren't just intellectual concepts. They're practical tools for transformation. The question is, are you willing to do the inner work necessary to move beyond unconscious projection toward conscious relationship? If this exploration of Jung's psychology has opened new perspectives for you, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We'll be diving deeper into Jung's insights about psychological development, including his work on individuation, the shadow, and what he called the transcendent function. And here's my challenge for you for the next week. Practice recognizing when you might be seeing others through the lens of your own projections, rather than seeing them as they actually are. Notice what you discover and share your insights in the comments below.